Hello, humans. Today I want to talk about the Chinese calendar. It's something that's fascinated me for a very long time. Um, the actual thing that inspired me to start studying Chinese language was the first time I saw a Chinese almanac. So this one is for 2022, which we're almost done with because it's not Chinese New Year's yet, even though it's January. And when I looked inside the first time I saw one of these in the 1990s, I was just fascinated with all of this stuff besides the calendar part. Here's the calendar part. I decided that I just wanted to learn enough Chinese to read, enough Chinese to be able to read the almanac. And since then, there are other things I've moved on to, although I really love the almanac. So I studied feng shui and Chinese astrology with a teacher, and of course, Chinese medicine before that. And the calendar has really worked into all of this kind of stuff, but modern Western people don't often pay much attention to it. So this video is part one, just an overview of the Chinese calendar. And I'm not going into all the scientific detail of, angle of the sun and that kind of stuff, but just what you need to be able to use some of this stuff. So this is part one. Part two, we'll have some more details about something called the 10,000 year calendar, which is another fascinating document. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 10 heavenly stems, the 12 earthly branches, which are an important part of the Chinese calendar. There'll be a second part of this video that will go into some more detail, but for now, let's start with stems and branches and a few other things like the 24 GHE and so forth. In the past, any Chinese person, literate or not, would be familiar with the Chinese calendar, just like, everybody knows Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Everybody knows, Christmas and New Year's and whatever holidays. It's just something that's used every day. And so to us, modern people, it kind of seems esoteric, but it's really it has esoteric uses, but in and of itself, it's just part of Chinese culture. So the stems and branches were found in ancient oracle bones. They were used as the calendar even so far back in history. And so, this is just a picture of an oracle bone, and there's an inscription, not the same one that's on this particular bone. And in the inscription, it says on a Wu Yin day. So you can see they're using the 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches to, use for their calendar at this time. So first, let's talk about the stems. Let me get my little pen out. Okay, there it is. These are like a 10-day week. We go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday again, and it just cycles forever. There's no real beginning or end. It just continues forever. This is like that. It's a series of 10 that repeats forever. And it is applied, it was originally applied to days, so it was like a 10-day week, but later it became applied to months and years and hours and other things that even didn't have to do with time. And so, they have names in Chinese, Jia Yi, Bing, Ding, Wu, Ji, Geng, Xin, Ren, and Gui. And they're always in the same order. So they have numbers associated with them. So Jia is number 1 and E is number 2 and so forth. Note that odd numbers are yang and even numbers are yin, and this goes with these stems as well, that The odd number ones are yang, and the even number ones are yin, and they're also associated with an element. Now, back in the oracle bone time, there was not the five elements, so they weren't, associated with elements then, but eventually they became associated with elements. And so we have, a yang wood and a yin wood, a yang fire and a yin fire, a yang earth and a yin earth, yang metal, yin metal, and of course, yang water and yin water. And so, for example, I was born in a Gui stem year, so that means I was born in a year that has some association with yin water. And so these are chi that comes from heaven. And that's the series. If you arrange them in a 5-element diagram, then you can just see the pattern pretty easily. There's a yang wood and a yin wood, a yang fire and a yin fire, a yang earth and a yin earth, and so forth, going around in order. And always the yang one is first and the yin one is second. And so they're 10 because yin and yang of each of the 5 elements adds up to 10. The 12 earthly branches are a little bit more complex. And so again, they have names. And by the way, these names don't really have meanings. I mean, some of the words do have meanings, and you could talk about etymology, but really these are just names, just like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, originally had some meaning, but mostly we don't think about that meaning when we talk about, oh, it's Wednesday, now we're over the hump, or oh, it's Monday, do I have to go to work, or oh, it's Friday, payday, and we don't really think of what the names mean. So mostly these are just names for the 10 heavenly stems and the 12 earthly branches, and the meaning is not something we need to care about in a practical sense. So again, we have these as a series of 12 that repeats forever, just repeats again and again, always in the same order, never changing the sequence. And so they are associated with numbers. And again, odd numbers are yang and even numbers are going to be associated with yin. I'm sure you're familiar with these already because the 12 animals that, oh, I was born in a snake year. Oh, you were born in a monkey year, right? Those are stand-ins for the branches. And in fact, kind of if you're professional, you're going to use the branch name. But if you're just, like talking to somebody who's not a professional, then the animals are easier to grasp. You can get an image from the animal. But if you say, there's no really image with it, but if you say snake, that gives you an image. So, in talking to people who don't use these, then animals are common. But if you're professionally doing astrology or feng shui or other things, then the grown-ups use the branch name. And so if we look at the pattern in the element column, where's my pen? There it is. Okay. So we've got a yang water it starts with, but it also, number 12, ends with a yin water. So the two waters are in a row. It's just one's at the beginning, one's at the end, but there is no real beginning or end because it just cycles forever. So we've got two waters, and then we've got an earth. My pen, sorry. Then we've got an earth, and then we've got two. Geez, this pen is not like showing me where it is. Okay. So then we've got two woods, and then we've got an earth, and then we've got two fires, and then we've got an earth. And then we've got two metals, and then we've got an earth, and then back to water again. So you can see there are two of each element with an earth in between. And so it's laid out differently because with 12, if there are 5 elements and they're 5 doesn't go into 12 evenly. There are 2 additional leftover remainder. And so those are added to Earth because with the 12 earthly branches, Earth is central. I'll diagram it out in a minute. So we've looked at the associations there. Okay. These are also associated with the time of day and with the month of the year. In ancient China, they used 2 hour time periods. And so the hour is 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. That also means that generally the day started at 11 p.m., not at midnight. And so then the Chou hour is 1 to 3, and so forth. The Wu hour is 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And so each of these 2 hour periods is associated with one of the branches. And in ancient China, you would say, okay, I'll meet you at the hour. Which would mean I'll meet you sometime between 9 and 11 a.m. So this is how they talked about time, time of day. In addition, the months, there are 12 months in most years. We'll talk about the leap year later. So the months, they're 12 months, but unfortunately, just to make things complicated and to give people a hard time, the first branch is not the first month of the year. In fact, the branch is when the winter solstice is. And in sometimes in very ancient China, the winter solstice was the beginning of the year, not Lunar New Year's. And so originally at that time, when the winter solstice month was the beginning of the year, then the first branch would be the first month. But at some point, the first month became the beginning of spring, which is the yin branch, and that's associated with yang wood, and wood is spring. Now, while this is, the pinyin says yin, it's a different character than yin and yang. Okay, so don't confuse this yin with the yin of yin and yang. It's a different tone, it's a different character. It's obvious to a Chinese person, even if it's a little confusing in English. So the yin month, if we look back on this page, where's my pen? Okay, here it is. The yin month is yang wood, and wood is the beginning of spring. It's the first wood month. It's the beginning of spring, and that is the first month of the year is associated with the yin branch. And always the summer solstice is going to be in the, this pen, the Wu month is always going to have the summer solstice. The Zi month is always going to have the winter solstice. The Mao month will have the spring equinox, and the You month will have the autumn equinox, always, every year, no matter what. So when they have to insert leap months, they have to do it in a way to preserve those 4 months. So those are the months. And so if you're doing some kind of calculation that asks for the month number, then you need to go with the number here in the right-hand column that has yin as number 1, even though it's actually the third branch. This is really a confusing thing, but what can you do? I'd also like to point out, while I'm talking about confusing things, that there's a Wu branch with the third tone, and there's also a Wu stem, oops, here, with the fourth tone. So again, if you're just looking at the pinyin and you don't know the tones and you don't know the characters, you have to be very careful not to confuse the Wu fourth tone stem with the Wu third tone branch. So yeah, but you get used to this after a while if you work with the Chinese calendar. So one more thing before I move on. In time, it gets very complicated if you're trying to do a Bazi or like 8 characters, 4 pillars chart, and you need to know the time of birth. The problem is that the time on the clock isn't necessarily the time according to the sun. And so in standard time, not daylight savings time, the hour is 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. But if it's currently daylight savings time, you have to correct to go back to be closer to the sun's time. Because just because the government says change your clocks doesn't mean the sun suddenly jumps. The sun doesn't jump. And so you have to correct for daylight savings time. So I have a little table here for that. But if it's of utmost importance, you also have to correct for, is it latitude or longitude, which gets pretty complex. And I'm not going to go into that because time zones are sometimes drawn on political boundaries and they're not just and if you're in one end of the time zone, it's going to be like a different sun time than in the other end of the time zone. So that gets complex. I'm not going to talk about that. But this is just the general idea. I will say in ancient times, they weren't overly fussy about the precise minute. Like if you were doing somebody's astrology chart and you were uncertain because it's kind of borderline between two different hours, you would do both charts and see which one fits the person better. Um, Rather than trying to be so precise with the clock and with the calculation. So, okay, those are the 12 earthly branches. If we put them in a arrangement, a diagram we're going to have Earth in the center. Excuse me. And so the first branch is Z, which is water. The second one is Cho, which is earth. The third and fourth one are wood. The fifth one, Chen, is earth again. The sixth and seventh one are fire. The eighth one is earth again. The ninth and 10th one are metal, and the 11th one is earth again. So you can see earth is central, earth is in between, earth is transformation from one element to another. So this is how the 12 earthly branches work. And so, when you have all 5 elements in a circle with earth as one part of the circle, not in the center, that's kind of based on the 10 heavenly stems. That's how heaven looks at the 5 elements. To heaven, earth isn't all that important. But the 12 earthly branches, earth is much more important here on earth. I will point out that the character earth as opposed to heaven is different than the character for earth element. But still, earth element has extra powers down here on earth, whereas in heaven, it's just one more thing. So, the 12 earthly branches have a lot more earth in it because earth is important down here on earth. Everything's rooted in the earth. So then let's look at some things. Even though there are 12 earthly branches, 4 of them are kind of like the north, south, and the east, west. So they're like, the 2 axes. And so, we'll remember in Chinese maps, traditionally, south was at the top because south is hot in the northern hemisphere and heat rises, so it's on the top. So Wu is the summer solstice. The Wu branch is the summer solstice. It's also associated with the noon hour, and it's also associated with south because the directions also have these same characteristics. Opposite that, we have Zi, which is the winter solstice, which is midnight, and which is also the north. Then on the east-west axis, we have Mao is the month of spring that has the spring equinox. It's also associated with the hour of sunrise or dawn and with the east. Yo, which is metal, is associated with the autumn equinox, with sunset or dusk, and with the west. And so these 4 of the 12 branches are kind of extra important. A little bit about season while we're at it. In the West, a season begins on the solstice or the equinox. Like the winter solstice is the first day of winter in the Western calendar. In the Gregorian calendar, is that what we have? But in the traditional Chinese calendar, as in many other ancient calendars, including ancient calendars of Europe, that the winter solstice is really the middle of winter, the midpoint of winter, the peak of winter. And, the same with the summer solstice and the spring equinox and the autumn equinox, they're the peak of the season. And so there are these things that in Chinese, it's called the Bajiang, the 8 mains, which are 8 main times of the year, the solstices, the equinoxes, and the midpoint halfway in between. So if we take the winter solstice and the spring equinox and we count the number of days in between, and then we divide that in half and find that midpoint, that day is called Li Chun, and it's the beginning of spring. And that's going to fall around February 4th. Note that solstices and equinoxes are solar events, they're not lunar events. Okay, so we're talking solar calendar here. And again, the midpoint between the spring equinox and the summer solstice is going to be when summer begins. That's Li Xia, which is summer begins, and that's around May 5th. I think something like that. The midpoint between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox is Li Chou, is when fall begins, when autumn begins, and that's around August 8th. It sounds early, but the days are noticeably getting shorter already at that point. This may not make sense to you when you think about weather, but when you think about light, it makes sense because you can already notice by February 4th, the days are longer. It's not getting dark quite so early. So think of this as being about the amount of light. Finally, the midpoint between the autumn equinox and autumn equinox and the winter solstice will be the first day of winter, Li Dong, and that's around November 7th, something like that. So the start of the season in the Chinese calendar is actually about 6 weeks before the start of the season in the Western calendar. One mistake I see people making is that if there's like a qigong that you're supposed to do in spring, they'll wait until the spring equinox to start doing it, and they've already missed half of spring, and then they're going to continue doing that spring qigong into halfway into summer, according to the Chinese calendar. So if there's a Chinese medicine recommendation for qigong or for food or for, whatever, if there's a recommendation for a particular season, you should make sure you know the dates of the season in the Chinese calendar and not use the Western dates for that. As I said, in ancient Europe, they also used this calendar at some point. For example, Shakespeare has a play, A Midsummer's Night Dream, and it takes place on the summer solstice. So how can the summer solstice be midsummer if it's already, the first day of summer? Right? Like today, we say the summer solstice, first day of summer, but then how could the Midsummer's Night Dream take place on the solstice if that was the first day of summer? It has to be the middle of summer. So you can even see in some remnants that our seasons used to be divided up differently. Okay, so there are different ways of diagramming out the 12 earthly branches. They're often used with a circular diagram, and in that case, Zi should be on bottom because it's north, and north is water, and water runs downhill. And Wu should be on top because Wu is south, and fire rises up, so it's on top. Mao should be in the left because it's east, and Yo should be on the right because it's west. So in things like Chinese astrology, things like Bazi or like 8 characters, then these relationships have a lot of importance. This kind of diagram, because ones that are opposite, like Zi and Wu, are not supposed to get along. They like crash into each other and have conflict, whereas ones that are in a basically triangular geometric relationship are going to be harmonious with each other. And there's some other relationships, but basically in Chinese astrology, you're working out some geometry with the relationships of these. And so that goes beyond, though, what we need to talk about for this class. They're also sometimes used as something called the 12 palaces. And in that case, they're generally put in a square diagram or rectangular diagram, where, they're still always in the same order. But again, we have north and Zi in the bottom, although in this arrangement it has to be a little bit skewed because there's no center palace at the bottom. And then, Wu and Su and Wu, which are the two fire ones, are, at the top, and you can see the earth ones in between, and metal on the right in the west, and wood in the east on the left. And in this kind of diagram, there are other relationships that you can work out. For example, the ones that are in the 4 corners have a lot of change and movement. The 4 earth branches are said to be very stable. They can even become like stuck and stubborn and so forth because they can have too much stability. The 4 main directions, north with Zi and south with Wu and east with Mao and west with Yo, those are called sometimes the 4 peach blossoms, and they actually are more creative and artistic and romantic. And so this is kind of part of certain things like Zui Doshu astrology. But again, that's beyond today. Okay, so I spent a lot more time talking about the branches. The branches have a lot more going on, but we talked about the stems, which are from heaven, and the branches, which are from earth. And then humans are in between, Tian Di Ren, heaven, earth, and humans in between. And so the 10 heavenly stems are like chi that's raining down on us and affects us. And the 12 earthly branches are excuse me, chi that's radiating upward from the earth and affecting us, and humans are in between, receiving the benefits, the bounty of both heaven and earth. This place that we live in between heaven and earth is sometimes called the Qi Jiao, or the Qi intersection, which is basically the biosphere. It's where the Qi of heaven intersects with the Qi of earth. And so heaven gives us light and air and weather, which is needed for, to grow plants, to grow things. We need light and air and weather, like rain and seasons and stuff like that. And earth gives us, plants and animals and, stone and earth to build shelter and to grow food and to make clothing and so forth. And so humans need things from both heaven and earth, and we receive things from heaven and earth. And so in a chi sense, then the 10 heavenly stems are 10 types of chi that heaven gives us, and the earthly branches are 12 types of chi that earth gives us. And they interact with each other. I told you one is a 10-day cycle and the other is a 12-day cycle. And so when you actually run them all together, they continue through in order forever and ever and ever. There are actually 60 possibilities that always happen in this same order. In Chinese, they're called the 60 jiazi, because jia is the first stem and zi is the first branch. And so that just means all of them. And so I don't really need to talk about this in huge detail. Where's my pen? There it is. Okay, but if you look at the first 10, you can see we've got stem 1 through stem 10, and then 11, we start with stem 1 again through stem 10, but the branches have 12. So you can see that when we get to the 11th position, we have the first stem again, but we still have the 11th branch. And for number 12, we have the second stem and the 12th branch. And for the 13th one, we have the third stem, but the first branch. And so they're just going through in order and combining with each other, kind of like two gears that have a different amount of teeth. So when one gear makes a complete revolution, the other gear isn't quite done yet. And so they keep partnering up with different ones until, again, we've got, 10 stems and 10 stems but 12 branches, and we're not quite all the way through. And then finally, when we get to number 60, this cycle of 60 is complete, and we have the last stem with the last branch, and then it begins again with number 1. So that's the cycle of 60, and that's important in feng shui and astrology and calendar, and it can be used in medicine. For example, if you're doing chronoacupuncture, selecting points by the time of day, this gets important. So yeah, the cycle of 60 is every possible combination. Yin only combines with yin. So yin stems with yin branches, yang stems with yang branches. You never have a yin and yang pair in this system. So there's that. I mentioned the seasons before. Maybe my slides could have a different order. Anyway, so they're 12 months. And the first month of the year, as I told you, is actually the third branch, which is the yin branch. And that's wood element. It's young wood. So spring begins at that time. And then the second month is Mao, which is yin wood. And so, of course, the 2 wood months are going to occur in spring. And then we have an earth month for transformation. The transformation happens, and now we have 2 fire months for summer, and then another earth month for transformation. So the first 3 months are the months of spring, the second 3 months are the months of summer, and then we have 2 metal months plus an earth month for transformation, and that's autumn. And then we have 2 water months and then an earth month for transformation. That's winter. And then I told you that, Li Chun is the beginning of spring. It's that place halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox, and that's around February 4th. And so I put in the approximate date. These dates can vary by a day. It could be February 3rd, it could be February 5th in different years, but most often it's February 4th is the first day of spring in the Chinese calendar. And so just to compare, as I was mentioning earlier in this slideshow, that the first day of spring in the West is March 21st or 22nd or 20th, but the first day in the Chinese calendar of spring is February 4th. And again, if you're doing any kind of thing to do with Chinese medicine, Chinese culture, and it wants to happen in the spring, use the February 4th date, not the March 21st date. So the Chinese calendar is pretty complex. It's what we call a lunisolar calendar, which means it has lunar aspects and it has solar aspects. Okay, so the lunar aspects is that there are lunar months, which start with the new moon. When the moon is totally dark, that's always the first day of the lunar month. The solar aspects are based on the solstices and the equinoxes, which the ancient Chinese, they were amazing astronomers and they knew about the solstices and the equinoxes. And from that, they developed something called the 24 Jieqi, which is often called the 24 solar terms. So in the Chinese calendar, it does get confusing because there's some lunar stuff and some solar stuff. But our calendar in the West is similar. Ours is mostly a solar calendar because, the equinoxes and solstices occur on a very specific day each year. And while there's a little bit of wobble in it, because remember, 365 days is not a complete year, it's 365 and a quarter days. So every 4 years, we have to add in a leap day to keep the calendar stable according to the position, the apparent position of the sun. To keep the seasons in their appropriate time. And so, every 4 years we have a February 29th, and then that makes like a little bit of wobble. So the solstices in the Western calendar often vary by a day or so based on where they are in this, 4 year cycle of adding an extra day once every 4 years. The ancient Chinese dealt with this kind of problem a little bit differently, but still solar things in the Chinese calendar transfer very easily into the Western calendar and vice versa. But the Western calendar, we do have some lunar stuff. For example, Easter and Passover, you have to look up when are they going to be, because every year they're like on a different date. You can't just know. It's not like New Year's Day, which we know is going to be January 1st, or it's not like, um, Christmas, which is December 25th every year. But with Easter and Passover, it moves around because it's based on the lunar calendar. And in the Islamic calendar, that's also a lunar calendar. So, for example, Ramadan moves, but there's a difference because the Islamic calendar doesn't use a leap month to stabilize the calendar. And so Ramadan keeps like changing. Sometimes it's in the summer, sometimes it's in the spring, sometimes it's in the winter, whereas Easter and Passover are always at a specific time of the year. So those kind of holidays, and Chinese Lunar New Year is, with the lunar calendar, Easter, Passover, Ramadan are with the lunar calendar, but most of our other stuff is the solar calendar. So Chinese calendar has this lunar and solar aspect as well. And so now I have to introduce the 24 Jieqi, or the 24 solar terms, if that's what you want to call them. And if we take, let's see, this stupid pen there, here's the winter solstice, and here's the summer solstice. Sorry, I couldn't find a diagram I liked in English. And here's the spring equinox, and here's the autumn equinox. So if we take those 4 dates, and if we divide them in half again, we get the beginning of spring, we get the beginning of summer, we get the beginning of autumn, and we get the beginning of winter. Sorry. And then if we divide it again and we put 2 more divisions in between each of the 8 mains, each of these 8 places, we get 24 sections of the year. And so each of these 24 sections of the year is about 15 days. So it could be 16 days, could be 15 days, but approximately 2 weeks. And so the year in the Chinese calendar has these 24 2-week periods of time. They each have names that hook in mostly to the agricultural calendar, like insects awaken, or grain is sprouting, or great heat and little heat, and so forth. So these are 24 sections of the year. And in Chinese, there are books that tell you yangsheng or nourishing life stuff to do in each of these 24 time periods. Like they're different exercises, they're different food, they're different meditations, they're different activities for each of these 24 little mini seasons. In some calculation methods, then these are combined into solar months as opposed to lunar months. Um, so in other words, if you put two 15-day periods together, you come up with a 30-day period, which is basically a month. And so for example, many people, so there's some controversy for Bazi or 8 characters or 4 pillars. Many people use the solar calendar for 4 pillars, and some people use the lunar calendar for 4 pillars. But my teacher, we used the 24 GHE. So you had to figure out like what month you were born in this kind of solar month, just like the West has solar months. And so, for example, I was born sometime between, where am I, June, sometime in June. So I was born in the 5th month, according to Bazi, or 8 characters, which would give me the Wu branch for my month pillar. Yeah. And so on this slide, then we have spring and summer, the 24 GHE, and we have on this slide the autumn and winter. And again, the start date will vary within a day because there's a little bit of wobble in the calendar, but it's very close to, it's like, there's a very exact borderline, and it's not depending on the moon. So yeah, these are sometimes used in calculation methods. Yeah, this is just, again, to show you the 12 months if you're using the solar calendar, not the lunar calendar. I'm going to make another video to talk more about the lunar calendar. So this is like the 12 months of the year if you're using the 24 GHE to make months. So let's discuss, we're almost done. If you're wondering when will I stop, let's discuss some of the differences between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar. The lunar months start from the new moon and go on to the next new moon. Okay, here we are, lunar calendar. Okay, the solar calendar doesn't use lunar months, it uses the 24 solar terms, the 24 GHE. The lunar calendar, of course, follows the moon. The solar calendar follows the sun. So yeah, the lunar calendar is based on the phases of the moon. The 15th day of each lunar month is going to be the full moon day, whereas the solar terms are 15 or 16 days long. And so there are 24 of them to make up a full year, whereas with lunar calendar, there are 12 or 13 months, because 7 times in 19 years, you need to have a leap month to correct so that the months that are associated with spring stay in spring. So 7 times in 19 years. And that's a standard, like whether it's the Jewish calendar or the ancient European lunar calendar, just if you want to keep it synced up, then 7 times in 19 years, you need to have a leap month. Whereas the solar calendar doesn't need a leap month because it's just taking the year like one big pie and dividing it into 24 equal portions. The lunar calendar doesn't align with the Western calendar. In other words, you can't count on when will Chinese New Year's be. You have to look it up every year because it's just kind of moving about and not on a stable date in the Western calendar. But the 24 solar terms, I mean, yeah, it might be February 4th or February 5th, but you always know within a day when is the first day of spring. Then these are used for different things. So it's not like one is useful and the other is not. Shu, which is a type of Chinese astrology, it's the kind that uses the 12 palaces. Remember that rectangle with the 12 branches going around the rectangle? Shu is a pretty interesting kind of Chinese astrology that uses the lunar calendar. And I Ching calculations generally are going to use the lunar calendar. And there's something called Xiaolu Ren, which I'm going to talk about in an I Ching class that I teach, and that uses the lunar months. Um, yeah. So things like plum blossom, I Ching calculation uses the lunar calendar. Okay, the solar calendar, well, my teacher used it for 4 pillars, although some people do use the lunar calendar for 4 pillars. The solar calendar is used for day selection, choosing a good day for a wedding or a grand opening or things like that. And feng shui, generally the calculations to do with timing use the 24 GHE or the 24 solar terms. And there's so many other calculation methods. I can't name them all, but that's the, just some idea that, if you want to do calculation arts, you kind of need to be familiar with both aspects of the Chinese calendar. So the final thing I want to talk about is that mostly we've been talking about time, but I've mentioned space a little bit. And the compass, of course, the Chinese invented the compass. They divided the compass into 24 compass directions, or they're actually called 24 mountains in Chinese, 24 compass directions, just like they're 24 jieqi. And so, time and space have things in common. For example, the Zi branch, okay, got my pen to be in the right place. The Zi branch is north, but of course, we've also seen it's the winter solstice and we've also seen it's midnight. And so, time and space have characteristics in common. Those are water characteristics for that. And so each of the 24, there are 8 directions if you count northeast and southeast and northwest and southwest, the 4 corners. Then there are 8 compass directions, and each of the compass directions have like 3 sub directions within it. So 3 times the 8 directions makes 24 compass directions. And it's actually kind of pretty complicated. And, if you're learning feng shui, you have to learn more about this. There's certain activities that require this knowledge, but for Chinese medicine, not so much. And I'm primarily talking for Chinese medicine practitioners. So I'm not really going to spend more time talking about this, but these are the 24 directions, and they're associated with stems and with branches and with 4 of the 8 trigrams, because they're 10 stems and 12 branches, which makes 22, but I'm confusing myself. Anyway, it adds up. Oh, because Wu and Ji are not. So there are eight stems are used. The 2 earth stems are not used. And so 8 stems are used, 12 branches, that makes 20. And then the 4 trigrams of the 8 trigrams makes 24. It's really kind of complex. But anyway, so this is Wopan, which is a Chinese compass that's all decked out with different rings that give different information for feng shui. So this is a diagram of a simple one, and it shows you the 24 directions, and there's stem or branch or trigram, and yeah. Basically, then that's what I wanted to talk about, just a little intro into Chinese calendar, stems and branches, 24 GHE, the directions, and eventually, I hopefully not too far in the distance, I'll show you how to read a 10,000 year calendar, which is this really cool book where you can look back through all the years, or you could look into the future and find calendar information to do astrology or feng shui or other calculations. And so yeah, I'll talk in some more detail about the information in the 10,000 year calendar, and also the lunar calendar is a big part of it. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. That's it.